Ars Notoria, Episode 4, Chapter 7, When Systems Push Back. Pressure at the boundary. Until now, the system has been largely intrapersonal. You stabilized interpretation. You reduced internal contradiction. You built trajectory awareness. You crossed consolidation thresholds. You developed gravitational coherence. But architecture does not exist in isolation. The moment it encounters another system, new dynamics emerge. Every institution has architecture. Every social group has architecture. Every information network has architecture. Every hierarchy has reinforcement patterns. These systems are not neutral. They exert structural pressure. When your internal architecture interfaces with external architecture, three outcomes are possible: absorption, collision, negotiation. Absorption occurs when the external structure overrides internal calibration. Identity shifts to match dominant incentives. Behavior adapts for approval, security, or belonging. Over time, trajectory realigns with environmental gravity. Collision occurs when rigidity meets rigidity. Internal structure resists adaptation entirely. External friction escalates. Energy expenditure rises. The system may fracture under prolonged tension. Negotiation is the mature response. Negotiation does not mean compromise of core trajectory. It means adaptive alignment without surrendering structural mass. This requires clarity about what is structural and what is peripheral. Not every behavior reflects core architecture. Not every preference defines identity. Not every external demand threatens coherence. The architect must differentiate between flexible surfaces and structural foundations. Foundations remain. Surfaces adapt. Without this differentiation, interface under scale becomes destabilizing. With it, interface becomes strategic. Chapter 7 will examine how mature architecture navigates power structures, incentive systems, and collective identities without losing internal sovereignty. This is where architecture becomes political, not in ideology, but in structural positioning. Incentive structures. Systems do not oppose you directly. They shape incentives. Incentives determine behavior without explicit coercion. They reward alignment. They penalize deviation. Over time, reinforcement patterns reshape identity more effectively than confrontation ever could. Most people believe resistance comes in the form of prohibition. In reality, it comes in the form of reward. Institutions reward conformity with access. Organizations reward alignment with stability. Markets reward predictability with security. Social groups reward mirroring with belonging. None of these mechanisms announce themselves as pressure. They feel like opportunity, and opportunity is rarely questioned. When mature architecture enters structured environments, it encounters layered incentive systems. These systems are optimized for continuity. They reinforce behaviors that sustain their own structure. This is not malicious. It is structural self-preservation. If your trajectory aligns with systemic incentives, interface is smooth. If your trajectory diverges, friction increases, not through attack, but through subtle withdrawal of reward. Promotion stalls, visibility decreases, access narrows, approval fades. The system does not fight you. It simply stops reinforcing you. For undeveloped architecture, this is destabilizing. Belonging becomes more valuable than coherence. Reward becomes more compelling than trajectory. Identity begins adjusting at the surface, then at the core. But gravitational architecture evaluates incentives differently. It distinguishes between strategic adaptation and structural compromise. Not every incentive is a trap. Not every divergence is noble. The architect must ask, does this reward accelerate trajectory, or does it redirect it? If reward strengthens long-horizon calibration, alignment is strategic. If reward narrows long-horizon autonomy, alignment becomes absorption. Absorption is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. Small adjustments accumulate. Trajectory shifts subtly. And one day, architecture serves the system instead of operating within it. Chapter 7 continues by examining how identity behaves when incentive pressure becomes persistent rather than occasional. Identity under persistent pressure. Occasional pressure tests stability. Persistent pressure reshapes identity. When incentive structures operate continuously, they do not merely influence behavior, they alter self-perception. Over time, repetition under pressure modifies narrative framing. Narrative framing is the bridge between action and identity. If a system repeatedly rewards a specific behavior, the mind seeks coherence. It constructs justification. It reframes adaptation as preference. What began as strategic alignment can become internalized identity. This is how absorption deepens, not through force, through repetition. Persistent pressure operates through three mechanisms: normalization, gradual boundary shift, redefinition of success. Normalization reduces visibility of change. What once felt like compromise begins to feel routine. Gradual boundary shift adjusts tolerance. Actions previously rejected become acceptable in incremental steps. Redefinition of success shifts trajectory evaluation criteria. When success metrics change, identity recalibrates around them. This is subtle. There is rarely a decisive moment. There is accumulation. Architectural sovereignty requires meta-awareness at this stage. The architect must monitor narrative drift, not by questioning every action, but by periodically examining trajectory alignment. Does behavior still reflect long-horizon intent? Or has reward reshaped evaluation standards? Persistent pressure also produces fatigue. Fatigue increases susceptibility to absorption. The mind prefers lower resistance paths when energy decreases. Repeated negotiation under external gravity can erode structural confidence. Therefore, mature architecture must maintain energy reserves. Energy here is not motivation, it is clarity. Clarity preserves differentiation between adaptation and surrender. Without clarity, persistent pressure dissolves boundaries quietly. With clarity, pressure becomes data. Data can be integrated without restructuring core foundations. The next phase begins when pressure is no longer occasional or persistent, but systemic and multi-layered. Power without confrontation. Power rarely announces itself as force. It operates through calibration of possibility. In most structured environments, compliance is not demanded explicitly. It is engineered implicitly. Options are framed. Pathways are highlighted. Outcomes are weighted. What appears as free choice is often pre-filtered selection. Pre-filtered selection reshapes behavior without visible constraint. When architecture interfaces with organized power, it encounters this invisible shaping mechanism. Institutions rarely need to oppose deviation directly. They reduce exposure to alternative pathways. They alter reward frequency. They amplify certain narratives while muting others. This form of power is efficient because it avoids resistance. Resistance requires visible conflict. Calibration requires none. Consider how performance systems operate. Evaluation criteria determine advancement. Advancement determines influence. Influence determines access. Access determines opportunity density. Opportunity density determines future trajectory. The individual may feel autonomous while operating entirely within a calibrated field. Architectural maturity must recognize calibrated fields. Without this recognition, adaptation occurs unconsciously. Behavior shifts to match evaluation standards. Interpretation reframes constraint as meritocracy. Identity aligns with performance metrics rather than long-horizon direction. Power succeeds when calibration feels natural. When architecture under pressure begins optimizing for short-cycle validation, long-cycle trajectory weakens. This is not immediate collapse. It is directional drift. Power without confrontation also operates through narrative amplification. Certain interpretations are rewarded with visibility. Others receive silence. Silence reduces reinforcement density. Reduced reinforcement weakens competing models. Over time, dominant narratives appear inevitable. Inevitability reduces critical evaluation. Reduced evaluation increases absorption. Mature architecture does not reject power structures reflexively. Reflex rejection is as reactive as reflex compliance. Instead, it maps the calibration grid. What is being rewarded? What is being suppressed? What behaviors generate access? What behaviors reduce exposure? Mapping reveals structure. Structure reveals leverage. Leverage determines strategic engagement. There are moments when aligning with calibrated systems accelerates trajectory without structural compromise. There are other moments when alignment subtly redefines identity. The distinction lies in whether the system's reward logic narrows future optionality. Optionality is structural oxygen. When optionality decreases, architecture loses maneuverability. When maneuverability declines, long-term sovereignty weakens. Power without confrontation is most dangerous because it feels like participation. The architect must ask continuously, am I operating within the system, or am I being operated by it? Chapter 7 continues by examining multi-layered pressure, when incentives, narratives, and social expectations converge simultaneously. Converging pressure fields. Pressure rarely arrives from a single direction. It converges. In mature systems, incentives, narratives, and social expectations rarely operate independently. They intersect. They reinforce one another. They form overlapping pressure fields that increase directional force without increasing visibility. This convergence is what makes systemic influence powerful. An incentive may encourage alignment. A dominant narrative may frame that alignment as rational. A social structure may reward visible compliance. Each component alone is manageable. Together, they create density. Density increases gravitational pull. When pressure fields converge, resistance becomes more complex. The individual does not merely negotiate reward structures. They negotiate perception, reputation, access, interpretation. Consider how identity interacts with reputation under scale. Reputation is externally maintained narrative. It is fragile. It can be amplified. It can be withdrawn. Systems understand this. They rarely threaten directly. Instead, they shape reputational incentives. Visibility becomes conditional. Approval becomes cyclical. Alignment becomes publicly rewarded. The more visible the alignment, the stronger the reinforcement. This creates a feedback loop. Behavior produces recognition. Recognition produces identity validation. Validation increases commitment. Commitment increases conformity. Over time, internal architecture may not feel compromised. It feels affirmed. This is the subtle risk of convergence. When multiple pressure layers synchronize, they reduce internal dissonance. The system feels supported rather than constrained. Constraint becomes invisible. The architect must therefore analyze pressure fields collectively, not individually. Ask, are incentives aligned with narrative framing? Is narrative framing aligned with reputational reward? Is reputational reward aligned with trajectory? If all three align but trajectory narrows, absorption is occurring at a structural level. Narrowing trajectory does not always feel restrictive. Sometimes it feels efficient. Efficiency can mask dependency. Dependency increases when external validation becomes required for internal stability. When stability depends on external reinforcement, sovereignty weakens. This does not mean rejecting systems entirely. Total isolation is not strength. It is withdrawal. Mature architecture learns to operate inside converging pressure fields without allowing them to dictate core trajectory. This requires layered awareness. Surface behavior may adapt. Communication tone may adjust. Strategic timing may shift. But foundational direction must remain independent of external reward density. If direction becomes reward-dependent, identity shifts from architect to participant. Participants operate within gravity. Architects operate with gravity. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Chapter 7 escalates further by examining how fatigue interacts with converging pressure fields and how long-term exposure tests structural endurance. Endurance under continuous exposure. Short-term pressure tests conviction. Long-term pressure tests endurance. When systemic forces operate persistently rather than episodically, architecture is no longer challenged by intensity. It is challenged by duration. Duration reshapes tolerance. What feels misaligned at first may feel acceptable after prolonged exposure. What initially triggers alertness may eventually pass unnoticed. The nervous system adapts to repeated signals. Adaptation reduces reactivity. Reduced reactivity can be strength or erosion. Endurance is not stubbornness. It is calibrated stability over time. Under continuous exposure, even gravitational architecture experiences microfatigue. Not collapse, not reversal, but subtle depletion of clarity. Negotiation becomes routine. Adjustment becomes habitual. Vigilance declines. Decline in vigilance does not mean weakness. It means energy redistribution. Energy is finite. When structural interface requires constant adjustment, internal resources thin. This is why systemic environments favor time. They do not need to overpower architecture. They need to outlast attention. Outlasting attention produces drift. Drift rarely feels dramatic. It feels practical. It feels efficient. It feels socially intelligent. Gradual shifts accumulate. This is the real test of mature architecture. Can clarity sustain itself when reward cycles fluctuate? Can trajectory remain visible when incentives become ambiguous? Can identity resist narrative dilution when repetition normalizes adaptation? Endurance requires more than internal coherence. It requires periodic structural regrounding. Regrounding is deliberate reconnection with core trajectory, independent of environmental reinforcement. It is not rebellion. It is recalibration. Without regrounding, even coherent systems begin optimizing for local equilibrium rather than long-horizon direction. Local equilibrium is comfortable. Long-horizon direction is demanding. Sustained pressure increases the appeal of comfort. Comfort narrows exploration. Narrow exploration reduces optionality. Reduced optionality increases dependency. Dependency shifts gravitational center outward. This is not an abrupt transformation. It is slow, invisible, accumulated. The architect must therefore manage exposure cycles strategically. Continuous interface without recovery accelerates fatigue. Alternating engagement and distance preserves clarity. Distance restores perspective. Perspective restores trajectory. Trajectory restores sovereignty. Endurance is not constant resistance. It is intelligent pacing. Chapter 7 continues by escalating into structural negotiation at hierarchy levels, where pressure becomes asymmetric rather than equal. Multi-layered compression. There is a stage where pressure ceases to feel directional. It becomes atmospheric. When incentives, narratives, fatigue, and hierarchy converge simultaneously, the individual no longer perceives discrete forces. The environment itself feels dense. Density changes cognition. Under atmospheric compression, perception narrows. Attention prioritizes immediate stability. Long-horizon modeling weakens. Micro-decisions become optimized for short-cycle relief rather than trajectory continuity. This is not weakness. It is adaptive response. The nervous system responds to density by conserving energy. It reduces exploratory processing. It limits deviation. It seeks predictability. Predictability reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty reduction stabilizes physiology. Physiological stabilization preserves short-term performance. But short-term performance under compression can mask long-term drift. Compression operates through accumulation, not through crisis. Crisis is visible. Compression is gradual. When multiple structural layers exert pressure, optionality contracts. Each layer removes degrees of freedom. Incentives narrow behavioral bandwidth. Hierarchy narrows access. Narrative dominance narrows interpretation. Fatigue narrows cognitive flexibility. What remains is a constrained decision field. In constrained fields, architecture does not collapse. It condenses. Condensation increases rigidity. Rigidity feels stable, but rigidity under prolonged compression risks brittleness. Brittleness fractures under shock. The architect must therefore distinguish between structural firmness and reactive hardening. Firmness is aligned stability. Hardening is defensive contraction. Under multi-layered compression, the temptation is to harden, to reduce exposure, to limit vulnerability, to avoid friction entirely. Avoidance preserves short-term energy, but it reduces adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is required for long-term sovereignty. Compression also tests narrative resilience. When dominant systems repeat interpretive frames consistently, alternative narratives become cognitively expensive to maintain. Maintaining them requires effort. Effort decreases under fatigue. As effort declines, dominant narratives gain cognitive dominance. This shift is rarely conscious. It feels pragmatic. Pragmatism under compression may prioritize survival over direction. Survival is immediate. Direction is cumulative. Cumulative direction shapes identity across years. Thus, compression becomes a temporal filter. It filters out long-term thinking by increasing short-term demand. If architecture does not consciously protect long-horizon modeling, trajectory narrows silently. Protection does not mean withdrawal. It means deliberate re-expansion of cognitive bandwidth. Re-expansion requires three actions: re-establishing perspective beyond immediate environment, reinforcing identity independent of external validation, reintroducing optionality through controlled exploration. Optionality restores maneuverability. Maneuverability reduces brittleness. Reduced brittleness preserves elasticity. Elasticity sustains sovereignty under scale. The escalation of Chapter 7 does not culminate in collapse. It culminates in recognition. Recognition that compression is not attack. It is systemic density. Density can be navigated, but only if architecture maintains adaptive breadth. Sequence 9 will move deeper, into the moment when compression attempts to redefine identity itself. Identity redefinition under compression. There is a point where pressure no longer targets behavior. It targets identity. When multi-layered compression persists long enough, the system stops negotiating surface adaptation. It begins reshaping internal reference. This is the most decisive phase of systemic pushback. Earlier, incentives shaped action. Narratives shaped interpretation. Hierarchy shaped access. Fatigue shaped tolerance. Now compression attempts something more subtle. It attempts to redefine what you believe yourself to be. Identity is not static. It is a stabilized narrative built from repeated interpretation. It rests on reinforcement density. It relies on social mirroring. It draws coherence from continuity. Compression interferes with each of these. When behavior repeatedly aligns with systemic expectation, narrative follows. The mind prefers consistency. If action diverges from declared identity long enough, identity recalibrates to match behavior. This is not hypocrisy. It is coherence maintenance. Coherence protects cognitive stability. Under compression, if strategic alignment becomes prolonged, the system gradually internalizes alignment as authenticity. The phrase, "This is just who I am," often appears after enough repetition. This is the pivot. when external calibration becomes self-description. The danger here is not loss of individuality. It is loss of independent trajectory reference. Once identity redefines itself around systemic reward logic, trajectory becomes externally anchored. Long-horizon modeling narrows to what the system deems viable. External gravity becomes internal gravity. This transition is quiet. There is rarely internal alarm. The system feels stable but reoriented. Identity redefinition under compression occurs through three accelerators. First, linguistic shift. Language changes subtly. Descriptions of self align with dominant narratives. Value statements mirror systemic framing. Vocabulary narrows around rewarded constructs. Second, social mirroring. Feedback loops reinforce the revised identity. Approval stabilizes it. Repetition embeds it. Third, time compression. Long-term aspirations are reframed into shorter cycle goals aligned with systemic structure. What once required patience now seeks immediate validation. None of this feels forced. It feels adaptive. Adaptation is healthy. But adaptation without independent reference dissolves sovereignty. The architect must therefore protect one essential mechanism: internal self-description, independent of reward density. This does not require constant opposition. It requires periodic identity audit. Not, who am I in this system, but who would I be without it? This question re-expands trajectory beyond environmental gravity. Without this expansion, identity collapses into context. Context-bound identity is efficient, but it is not sovereign. Compression at this stage is no longer about survival or access. It is about narrative capture. Narrative capture is complete when identity justifies the system rather than navigating it. This is the deepest structural absorption. Chapter 7 moves next into countergravity, how architecture reasserts internal mass when identity pressure becomes direct. Countergravity. When systemic compression attempts to redefine identity, resistance through force is ineffective. Force increases friction. Friction increases fatigue. Fatigue accelerates absorption. Countergravity does not push outward. It increases internal mass. Mass is accumulated through reinforcement density, independent of environmental validation. If identity is repeatedly stabilized through internal coherence rather than external reward, gravitational center remains internal. This requires conscious reconstruction of internal reference. Under compression, external systems offer clear scripts. They define success. They define legitimacy. They define acceptable ambition. These scripts reduce cognitive load. Accepting them simplifies navigation. Simplicity is attractive. But simplicity imposed from outside narrows trajectory bandwidth. Countergravity begins by expanding narrative bandwidth deliberately. Narrative bandwidth refers to the range of self-interpretations available under pressure. If only one identity narrative feels viable, compression has succeeded. If multiple viable narratives remain accessible, optionality persists. Optionality preserves sovereignty. To expand narrative bandwidth, architecture must decouple identity from role performance. Role performance is context-dependent. Identity must be context-independent. This does not mean rejecting roles. It means refusing to collapse self-description into a single systemic function. Countergravity also requires time re-expansion. Compression narrows time horizon to immediate validation cycles. Countergravity stretches horizon deliberately. Decisions are evaluated not by immediate reward, but by cumulative alignment over years. Years reintroduce perspective. Perspective reduces urgency. Reduced urgency weakens external leverage. External systems depend on urgency to maintain influence. Deadlines, scarcity, visibility windows. These mechanisms compress choice. When urgency loses dominance, negotiation space expands. Countergravity, therefore, alters time perception intentionally. It slows internal evaluation, even when external tempo accelerates. This is not procrastination. It is recalibration of tempo. Tempo control is structural power. If architecture matches systemic tempo automatically, it becomes reactive. If it modulates tempo consciously, it remains sovereign. Another element of countergravity is controlled exposure. Continuous immersion increases compression density. Strategic withdrawal reduces environmental reinforcement dominance. Withdrawal is not escape. It is recalibration space. Space restores identity clarity. Clarity restores internal weighting. Internal weighting restores trajectory alignment. Countergravity is not loud. It is quiet mass accumulation. When internal narrative, time horizon, and reinforcement density realign, external compression loses absolute authority. It still exists, but it no longer defines identity. This is the turning point. Not rebellion, not isolation. Internal mass exceeding external influence. When mass exceeds influence, negotiation becomes balanced. When balanced, architecture can operate inside systems without dissolving into them. Sequence 11 will deepen this by examining dual operation, functioning within systemic gravity while maintaining independent trajectory simultaneously. Dual operation under pressure. Most people believe sovereignty requires separation. It does not. Separation is fragile. Isolation is unsustainable. Withdrawal as permanent strategy collapses under scale. The architect phase demands something more difficult, operating inside the system without being rewritten by it. This is dual operation. Dual operation means participating in structures while refusing structural absorption. This requires two simultaneous layers of cognition. Layer 1, functional alignment. Layer 2, strategic independence. Layer 1 engages with expectations. Layer 2 evaluates those expectations. Layer 1 performs. Layer 2 calibrates trajectory. The system sees Layer 1. Layer 2 remains invisible. This is not deception. It is dimensional awareness. If you only operate at the visible layer, your identity becomes defined by feedback loops, performance metrics, recognition cycles, reward systems. Each reward strengthens structural alignment. Over time, alignment becomes dependency. Dependency becomes identity. Dual operation interrupts this drift. It allows competence without capture. To maintain dual operation, you must construct internal meta-positioning. Meta-positioning means observing the game while playing the game. Not emotionally detached, not cynical, but structurally aware. Most people collapse into their environment because they lose meta-position. They begin reacting instead of modeling. Reaction reduces depth. Modeling restores structure. Dual operation requires deliberate cognitive partitioning, not fragmentation. Partitioning. Fragmentation is chaotic. Partitioning is architectural. One layer executes, one layer evaluates. Execution layer operates at system tempo. Evaluation layer operates at architect tempo. System tempo is fast. Architect tempo is slow. If architect tempo disappears, execution tempo dominates identity. You become the pace of your environment. Dual operation also demands selective opacity. Total transparency invites manipulation. Total secrecy invites suspicion. Opacity means controlled disclosure. You reveal what serves trajectory. You withhold what destabilizes trajectory. Not out of fear, out of structure. Under pressure, systems escalate reinforcement density. More visibility, more metrics, more comparison, more urgency. If you remain single-layered, this escalation pulls identity outward. Dual operation absorbs pressure differently. External evaluation enters Layer 1. Layer 2 contextualizes it. Context reduces distortion. Distortion is the primary tool of compression. When distortion is reduced, pressure weakens. There is another dimension. Dual operation prevents emotional hijack. When identity equals performance, criticism equals existential threat. When identity is layered, criticism becomes data. Data can be processed. Threat triggers collapse. Layering converts threat into input. This is not emotional numbness, it is structural buffering. Buffering preserves long-term continuity. Continuity preserves trajectory. Trajectory preserves sovereignty. The architect phase is not about rebellion. It is about continuity under systemic force. Most people break under pressure because they attempt to win the visible layer only. They overinvest in perception. They overreact to validation. They overcorrect for criticism. All of this strengthens systemic gravitational pull. Dual operation maintains internal vector. Vector matters more than moment. Moment is noise. Vector is architecture. If your vector remains stable, external turbulence cannot permanently redirect you. Dual operation also allows scale expansion. You can enter larger systems without dissolving into them. You can collaborate without identity dilution. You can compete without existential contraction. Because you are operating in two layers. The visible layer satisfies structure. The invisible layer preserves structure. Most people never build the second layer. They remain single-surface operators. Single-surface identity is easy to influence. Multi-layered identity resists assimilation. Sequence 12 will close this chapter by examining what happens when dual operation stabilizes, and pressure transforms from threat into refinement. Pressure as refinement. Pressure does not disappear, it transforms. If you reach this point, internal mass built, dual operation stabilized, systemic force no longer feels like attack. It feels like calibration. This is the shift. Early pressure feels existential. Later pressure becomes diagnostic. When identity is unstable, compression fractures it. When identity is layered and internally weighted, compression exposes weak joints instead of destroying structure. Weak joints can be reinforced. Destruction is not required. Most people never experience this shift. They remain in defensive posture permanently. Defense consumes energy. Calibration builds precision. Once dual operation stabilizes, external pressure stops defining self-worth and begins revealing structural inefficiencies. Where does urgency still hijack tempo? Where does validation still distort evaluation? Where does visibility still redirect vector? Pressure becomes measurement. This is refinement mode. Refinement mode is dangerous in a different way. It can produce arrogance. If you survive compression, you may mistake resilience for invulnerability. That illusion is fatal. Architectural sovereignty does not eliminate force. It allows force to sculpt. The difference is agency. When pressure sculpts against your will, you erode. When pressure sculpts under your observation, you refine. This requires conscious reframing. Not positive thinking, structural reframing. Instead of asking, "How do I escape this system?" the architect asks, "What is this force revealing about my current configuration?" Systems amplify what is unstable. They stress test assumptions. They expose blind spots. Without pressure, weaknesses hide. Under pressure, weaknesses surface. The sovereign mind does not panic at exposure. It studies it. The key here is selective absorption. Not all pressure deserves integration. Some force is noise. Some is manipulation. Some is structural feedback. Refinement depends on discrimination. Discrimination depends on internal clarity. If your internal narrative is stable, you can filter force without reacting to every fluctuation. This is maturity of architecture. You stop asking, "Is this fair?" and start asking, "Is this useful?" Fairness is moral framing. Usefulness is structural framing. Structural framing restores control. Pressure also accelerates evolution if properly metabolized. Without friction, growth plateaus. With friction, alignment sharpens. The architect phase is not comfort. It is sustained refinement. You will never again feel completely untouched by systems. But you will no longer feel defined by them. That difference changes everything. Identity becomes dynamic, but not dissolvable. Structure becomes adaptive, but not collapsible. Trajectory becomes resilient, but not rigid. This is when systems pushing back stops being a threat. It becomes training. Training increases capacity. Capacity increases optionality. Optionality preserves sovereignty. And sovereignty restores authorship. This closes Chapter 7. In Chapter 8, we move beyond resistance and refinement. We begin expansion. Not outward conquest, but structural scaling. Scaling without dilution. Power without dependency. Architecture without fragility. Do you want to continue the transmission? This transformation? Subscribe and leave a comment. From where on the globe do you watch?